So I want to just say thanks. It's great to see such a good community turnout. I wish it was under better circumstances, but nevertheless, it's great to see you all here tonight. As Marilyn mentioned, the first thing I want to just say off right out of the gate is what I think most people understand and know is that this is the result of the regulations that are potentially coming before you all as a result of a federal action, a lawsuit against the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and it's not a county-initiated proposal. I just want to put that out there again, just to be sure of things. But anyways, to get started tonight, I want to let folks know that I brought 4 handouts with me. I'm going to try to give, there's a lot of complex and technical details behind this initiative, and I don't want to get into that level tonight. My objective, which we'll talk about, is really just to give you a big picture overview of what's going on. But I did bring 4 handouts that are over at the side of the room just so people know what they are. I brought one handout called ESA Basics, and that's just a sort of primer on the Endangered Species Act for folks who are interested in that. I brought one piece of literature from the National Marine Fisheries Service, and that's the federal agency that is actually has written the proposed rule changes. This is their handout, which basically gives the logic behind the proposed changes to some extent. I brought a question and actually a contact sheet for myself, as well as contacts at the state and federal agency that can help answer more questions after this. If there's follow-up questions, our contact information is over there. And then finally, probably the most useful document I brought was this black and white handout called How to Read the Reasonable and Prudent Alternatives. The reasonable and prudent alternatives, as we're going to discuss, is those are the main action items that have been presented to FEMA. And if I use too many acronyms, please stop me. I'll try not to. There's a lot of acronyms in this discussion, but we'll go over that. This is describes how the reasonable and prudent alternatives should be interpreted and read. So this is actually the report itself is some 600 pages. This is just a few pages long, and it provides a good overview of what's going on. So those are the materials that are over there. And with that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of acronyms here. We're sort of at the intersection of 2 federal agencies, and I don't know why government likes acronyms, but these are some of the acronyms I'm going to be using tonight. Obviously, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. The NFIP, that's the National Flood Insurance Program. That's a sub-program that FEMA administers, and that is the program that is the proposed rule changes are occurring to, which will trickle down potentially to the county level. NOAA Fisheries, that's the same as NMFS, or National Marine Fisheries Service. That is the federal agency that has authority under the Endangered Species Act to list species and declare that a species is endangered or not. And they also are the ones that FEMA must consult with when a proposed action that federal agency is making, in this case FEMA, has a potential impact on a listed species. So NOAA Fisheries tells FEMA, in a nutshell, what they believe that agency is doing wrong and why it's impacting an endangered species. So NOAA Fisheries is the federal agency that wrote the proposed regulations, which are promulgating this whole discussion. Finally, next, the Endangered Species Act. Obviously, ESA, we're going to talk more about that. That's where the federal action stems. The biological opinion, that's the document that NOAA Fisheries issued, along with the reasonable and prudent alternatives. Those are the 2 documents that have been issued by NOAA Fisheries that explain the potential impacts to the endangered species. So hopefully that's not too confusing. The one handout, the reasonable, how to read the reasonable and prudent alternatives, has the acronyms on the back as well, so you can hopefully follow along there. So really my objectives for tonight are to describe what's driving this process a little bit more so people are more clear about it. And why and when any proposed changes may be implemented. And then I think most importantly, what people in this room probably want to know is what effect these proposed changes are going to have on your ability to use your land. So that's really my goal, to try to summarize those 3 objectives. So just to give you a little bit of background on why this is coming. The National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program that Lane County and most other jurisdictions in Oregon participate in. It was developed as an alternative to the expensive rising costs of flood disaster relief. When there were big floods in the 30s and 40s, the government would come in and pay exorbitant costs to bail out communities. This was designed in an effort to basically have folks who live in the floodplain pay their way into an insurance program that in theory would then be used to provide assistance when a flood came. Lane County, for its part in this process, has basically agreed to implement floodplain regulations locally that are developed at the federal level, I might add, as floodplain regulations. Local jurisdictions, counties and cities, implement the floodplain regulations, and in return, the federal government makes lower cost flood insurance available. It provides disaster assistance and relief and a number of other benefits. So it's sort of a trade-off. If the county agrees to be in the floodplain program, the federal government makes low-cost flood insurance available, provides disaster assistance, relief, etc. The Endangered Species Act, as most of you probably know, it was designed, and this is another federal program, which it sometimes is at odds with the National Flood Insurance Program. It was designed to prevent the extinction of species at whatever the cost. So there's a component of the Endangered Species Act known as Section 7, and I won't get into all the details, but what it basically says is that when any federal agency is proposing an action that could threaten or harm an endangered species, they have to consult with the agency that sort of has primacy over that species. In this case, it's an aquatic species, a pelagic ocean-going species, so the National Marine Fisheries Service is the consulting agency. So FEMA has to talk to the National Marine Fisheries Service to make sure their program is not in conflict with the ESA. For a number of years, FEMA operated assuming that their program was in compliance with the Endangered Species Act, and to a large extent, they still believe that their program is operating within the law. But in 2004, a lawsuit up in Washington State occurred against the against FEMA, claiming basically that the development that FEMA enables through its regulations within the floodplain has an adverse impact on habitat that salmon use. And that lawsuit went before federal court, and it was determined that FEMA needed to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service and determine if there was a taking of the listed species because of their actions. A similar court case was brought in Oregon in 2009, and FEMA realized the fact pattern was essentially the same, and the court ruling would be the same, so they settled and said, okay, we'll go into consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service, and that started back in 2009, and that process, that consultation process, unfortunately, is sort of a behind-the-scenes process. The rules of the ESA don't require those federal agencies to engage the public during that process. So this process went on for a number of years. At the state level, the state of Oregon knew this was going on, and the Department of Land Conservation and Development staff and others tried to interject themselves in the process to influence it some. That wasn't very successful, and as a result, this document came out, which is called the Oregon BIOP, and it made a determination that, in fact, the floodplain program, as it's administered in Oregon, does create jeopardy for a listed species. So, following up on that, the state has been working closely with FEMA, the State Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is basically the state, the program at the state level, which land use planning comes from, the statewide planning goals come from, and it's also the state agency that has authority to administer the National Flood Insurance Program in Oregon. So they've been working with local jurisdictions, Lane County, other cities, to try to provide some input into that process. And we'll talk more about that. But right now, at this time, what we've been presented is this document, this biological opinion document, that makes a number of assertions. And the primary assertion was that as this slide says, when development occurs within the floodplain, it negatively affects endangered species. And this was based on the biological opinion. As I mentioned, it's several hundred pages long. There's some scientific studies in there if you're interested in reading it. There was quite a bit of science that went behind it, but that was their determination. This map shows the areas in Oregon that are subject to the biological opinion. Because we're talking about anadromous fish species that spend part of their life cycle in the ocean, it's limited to those watersheds that have species that can get out to the ocean. So most of the southeastern part of the state isn't impacted by this opinion. So just to talk about what the main thrust of the biological opinion, as I mentioned, is this document called the Reasonable and Prudent Alternatives. And there are essentially 6 elements of that. We'll talk really about one main one tonight, but there is information I can provide on all 6 elements. Many of them have to do with the FEMA and how they write their rules and make their maps, and some of them deal with how the county and local jurisdictions implement the floodplain program. So element 1 is basically the federal emergency management agency telling local jurisdictions about these changes, that changes are coming, and that they need to prepare to implement them. Element 2 are what are known as the interim measures, and I think the National Marine Fisheries Service, based on what happened in Washington State, because don't forget this whole process rolled out in Washington State several years ago, they realized that this took a long time to roll out. So this time around, National Marine Fisheries Service has developed a set of interim measures which they want to see local jurisdictions implement, relatively soon. The timeline that we have for implementing the element 2 interim measures is March of next year, so about a year from now. I'll just mention right now that in talking with FEMA staff, they've pushed back pretty hard against the National Marine Fisheries Service and said a lot of the interim measures really can't be accomplished in that time frame, and they said if they need to ask for more time to roll out measures, they will. So that isn't a hard and fast date that these things will actually come online within 1 year. And as you'll learn, a lot of this is subject to change. There's still a lot of ambiguity here, and we're going to all try to provide as much clarity as we can, but things are still in flux to some extent. So the interim measures we'll talk primarily about tonight, because these are the ones that I think most people are concerned about. Element 3 is mapping and flood related hazards changes. So as part of this effort, National Marine Fisheries Service has told FEMA that they have to update their floodplain maps. They want FEMA floodplain maps to show things that aren't currently on the maps, such as riparian habitat corridors. But right now the maps just look at flood risks from a health safety standpoint. They don't take into consideration biological values, endangered species, things like that. So that's one of the changes. They've also told FEMA that they would like to see the maps show channel migration areas. So these are areas that may not currently be mapped within the floodplain, but because of the dynamics of the river, may in the future, the river may move and the floodplain may be expanded. So there's an interest in seeing channel migration maps developed as well. So those are some of the map changes. Element 4 is the floodplain management criteria. These would be the actual codified rule changes that the county would have to implement, and those come later down the road. Element 5 is data collection and reporting. That's basically the county needing to tell FEMA on a regular basis what kind of development is occurring in the floodplain, so they can monitor if these proposed actions are working. And then finally, element 6 is compliance and enforcement. Currently, with the way the county works with FEMA is that every 5 years we are audited to make sure that we are issuing floodplain permits as required under the National Flood Insurance Program. It's called a community assistance visit. FEMA pays us a friendly visit, looks through all our files, looks at our building permits, and makes sure that you're ensuring that houses are elevated to a certain extent, et cetera. So there already is an enforcement arm in effect, and we've been told that as a component of those annual visits, they'll be evaluating development to ensure that it also meets the reasonable and prudent alternatives. So those are the 6 elements. as I mentioned, there's a few that deal specifically with Lane County. Element 2 is the main one, interim measures, and that's what I want to spend my time on tonight. So the interim measures basically give us a choice. They say that Lane County, you can prohibit all development within the regulatory floodplain, which, obviously that's a choice, but not a very realistic one. Or you can determine if endangered species are in a certain stream segment, which we do have maps on that, and any actions to develop along that area of a stream must be mitigated to ensure that there's no net loss of habitat function. So basically, don't develop or develop and mitigate the development that's occurring. So some things to keep in mind about these interim measures, and this first bullet I think is the most important one. It's the one I really want folks to understand, is that these interim measures are only applicable in the regulated floodplain. So if you have mapped flood hazard areas on your property, that's where these regulations are applicable. I know that there's information about the 170-foot buffer, and folks assume, if I'm within 170 feet of the river, these things are going to apply to me. Well, if you're actually on a bench or you're above the elevated floodplain, these rules don't apply to you currently. Future mapping may change, and these rules may, just to warn folks, if you're found to be in a channel migration zone or something like that, these rules could extend onto your property. But as of right now, if you're not in the mapped floodplain area, which I assume most of the folks in this room are, because you're interested in this, they'll impact you if you're in a floodplain, and otherwise they won't at this time. So some of the main requirements is that the reasonable improvement alternatives want to see flood storage maintained. That means the floodplains obviously have the capacity to store floodwaters, so fill, building on fill, placing, riprap, things like that in the floodplain takes away some of that storage capacity. So they would like to see flood storage mitigated. And there's engineering techniques to do that. It's not like you'll never be able to place fill. There's things such as balance cut and fill. If you put fill in one location on a property, you take material out in another to ensure that the storage occurs. There's methods to do that. It's not necessarily easy or cheap, but there are options there. The next is to mitigate vegetation removal. So what NOAA Fisheries has proposed right now are some ratios. So for example, if a landowner wants to develop their property and they need to take out 10 trees, there's some ratios built in that you'll replace those trees, which are over a certain diameter, at a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio, depending on different factors on site. Another big concern is the use of impervious surfaces, because they create runoff concerns. So there's some impetus to limit the use of impervious surfaces, although that's impervious surfaces. Spell check. Okay, so, and then finally the most important one, and I think what most people are concerned about right now, is the establishment of the 170-foot riparian buffer zone. That's another acronym I should have had on there. They call it the RBZ, riparian buffer zone. So again, just to clarify, it's only applicable in the regulated floodplain. So even though it extends 170 feet from the ordinary high water mark, if your floodplain only goes in 50 feet, that's as far as the regulations apply. Within this area, water-dependent uses would be allowed if they're mitigated. So water-dependent uses are things like docks, pump houses, things that need to be close to the river. A guest house probably isn't water-dependent use in FEMA's and NOAA Fisheries view. So those sort of uses can occur, but they need to be mitigated. One thing which is interesting, and we've received more information from NOAA Fisheries, and they seem to be stepping back a little bit each time we talk with them. And when I say we, I mean the State Department of Land Conservation and Development and FEMA, as they engage NOAA Fisheries, we learn more and more that, the reasonable improvement alternatives as they're written aren't exactly clear. And NOAA Fisheries says, well, this is really what we meant. And the first read of the reasonable improvement alternatives made it sound like there's absolutely no development within 170 feet of the river. It's a complete moratorium on development. What they said is no, you can put uses in that area, but they have to be mitigated. And when it's not a water dependent use, they've created this term called hyper mitigation. So basically what we understand that to mean is not only is this proposed development that you want to put in the RBZ not going to impact listed species, your development proposal as a whole is going to create a net benefit. So I want to put a shed in the riparian buffer zone. I'm going to take out 5 trees. Well, because I'm doing that, I'm going to, then put in 20 trees over here, or, provide some off-site mitigation somehow through a mitigation bank. We don't know how all of these functions might play out, but they want to see those uses hyper-mitigated. And like I said, there's still a lot of unknowns about that terminology. It just kind of came out. We're trying to figure that out. But it's not a complete moratorium. And then basically the whole goal is to allow uses with, with no net loss. And that's going to be things like, in my understanding, you want to replace an existing house in the same footprint. It's already impacted. There's no net loss. That's allowed. You want to re-roof your house. You want to replace your driveway, and you're not expanding the footprint. You're not expanding the use into the riparian area. Those uses would be allowed. So some important things to note. These reasonable and prudent alternatives, and these are guidelines to FEMA. FEMA does ultimately have to follow them, but they can craft exactly how they work on the ground. They do have some flexibility and latitude in how they implement them, and that's why, as I mentioned, the state and local jurisdictions are trying to interject and provide feedback to FEMA on how those things are written, because we have a lot of concerns about how they're written, not just from a landowner standpoint, but from how our local planning regulations work, and how development in the state with our statewide land use planning program. Right now, the way the land use planning program is set up is that cities need to have a 20-year supply of buildable land within their boundaries. And if these rules come in and they take X number of acres out of that area, it puts us in conflict with our own statewide planning rules. So that's the sort of information that we're trying to provide to the federal government here. Another thing to know is that DLCD has advised counties that we really don't have to implement any of these changes until our ordinances are updated to reflect that. So even though we have NOAA fisheries telling us that there are interim measures that need to occur, we have DLCD and FEMA saying, well, until your floodplain regulations are actually updated, counties won't be required to do that. Now, this is one of these sort of complexities. We hear that message, and then at the same time, NOAA Fisheries tells us that, well, local jurisdictions and private landowners, for that matter, are still potentially liable under a different section of the Endangered Species Act that, in theory, we should be adhering to right now. So we're getting mixed messages. I just want folks to understand that we're still trying to sort through all this, and there's a lot of ambiguity and questions, but I'll talk about some of the working groups next. So right now, the Department of Land Conservation and Development has set up 4 working groups around the state, mainly made up of agency staff from local planning offices, some elected officials. There's 4 work groups that are trying to tackle these different components of the reasonable and prudent alternatives and provide some logical feedback and guidance on how they'll be implemented. There's a mapping work group, a habitat assessment and mitigation work group, the regulatory work group. I think that's primarily the legal counsel of a lot of jurisdictions. And then where the rubber hits the road is going to be the local permitting and process work group, and that's a work group I sit on. And we're trying to provide some guidance and feedback in how these regulations will actually play out on the ground. So, timeline for this, as I mentioned, it's going to roll out in several phases. The first one's already occurred. We've received notice from FEMA that the rule changes are occurring. Phase 2 is when those interim measures are supposed to occur by March 2018, as I mentioned. That timeline will probably get pushed back. Phase 3 are changes to the local criteria based on guidance from FEMA. These are changes that FEMA can require without changing their own rules, which literally takes an act of Congress for FEMA's rules to change. So these are things that will happen in the shorter term. Then phase 4 is mapping changes. This, I know for a fact, probably isn't going to occur by 2019. I've been involved in several FEMA remapping efforts, and they move at a glacial pace. This timeline probably isn't accurate. And then, in theory, FEMA's own regulations and the Code of Federal Regulations will be updated to affect the programmatic changes that, what I've heard, will be applicable across the country in dealing with the Endangered Species Act by 2021. So, many folks are probably asking what's the alternative, and the first one is why does the county choose to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program if it means we have to implement all these difficult choices. And there's a number of reasons why the county and most jurisdictions in Oregon, I think there's only maybe 2 jurisdictions in Oregon that do not participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and they have very small areas of floodplain within their boundaries that can't otherwise be developed. So basically, most jurisdictions that have any kind of floodplain are in the program, and for some serious and reasons, I won't say good reasons, but these are the facts. First, flood insurance wouldn't be available, the low-cost flood insurance that FEMA provides. I know it's not exactly low cost, but it's lower cost flood insurance that would be provided if you had to go through a private, like Lloyd's of London or some insurer like that. So next, no federal grants or loans would be available in floodplain areas. No federal disaster assistance would be provided. That's a huge one right there. And then no federal mortgage insurance. And if the county did opt out of the program, the development continued without taking the FEMA rules into effect. If we ever wanted to get back into the program, insurance rates for those structures that aren't in compliance then would be astronomical. So that would be a difficult thing to deal with. And then finally, I mentioned there may be some liability to local jurisdictions because they're still susceptible under the Endangered Species Act, and there may be some liability if a disaster occurs and the county didn't have rules in effect to help prevent that disaster. And then finally, our local comprehensive plan, which is our land use plan that we rely on, that would be out of compliance with the state. And what that would mean is that because, I don't want to get too into the details of the planning document, but because we rely upon the National Flood Insurance Program to address how the county deals with flood hazards, the state would basically say your plan is no longer in compliance, and therefore any time somebody tries to get a planning application filed through the county, it wouldn't be the county you'd be dealing with, you'd have to deal directly with the state because our plan would no longer be in place. It would create a lot of headache for folks, so that's a big one as well. Obviously, there's other alternatives which I want to talk about. The main one being legal challenges. One of the things folks should be aware of is that there was, back on November 23rd, there was a 60-day notice of intent to sue both the National Marine Fisheries Service and FEMA, and this was put together by the Oregon Home Builders Association, the Association of Realtors, Association of Oregon Industries, the Farm Bureau, and the Concrete and Aggregate Resource Association. They're just calling themselves the coalition, but it's obviously a coalition with a lot of development interest. They've written a pretty thorough intent to sue document, and we're getting close to that 60-day window. They basically asked NOAA Fisheries to reconsider and start the consultation process over with public input. From what I've heard, we're just about up against that 60-day timeline, and I don't believe NOAA Fisheries intends to change their mind. So a potential lawsuit is pending. That's the one I know about. Then there's the option of amending the Endangered Species Act, which obviously is possible, but that would require, again, an act of Congress. So call your congressman if you're interested in that. And then the new administration. What will the new administration bring? Obviously, the president has the ability to appoint heads of these agencies because a lot of this is, based on federal rules and laws and things like that. There may be some flexibility there, I just don't know, but that's a question as well. So, again, I have the sheet back on the table over there. If there are questions, I'm happy to, folks want to call me, talk to me offline about this, I'm happy to do that. Again, the state representatives who really have their ear to the ground on this are Amanda Punton and Chris Shirley. They're great folks to talk with, and then I also have some FEMA rep information up there as well. That website, I provided one website. That's really the best source to get information on this. This is a website put together by the State Department of Land Conservation and Development. It has access to all of the handouts that I have and a lot more. So if you want to research more information, that's the place to go get it. So, okay. Yep, that's all I had. So thanks.